Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Good afternoon to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. My name is Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Before we launch into today's webinar, we'll start off with a short mihi and karakia from Regional Prophet, Po Arataki, and Director Māori at WSP in New Zealand. For those of you not from New Zealand, the mihi and the karakia are a short greeting and prayer in te reo Māori, often used at the start of meetings and reflect the New Zealand cultural context. Reginald.
Kia ora tātou. E mihi mahana ki a koutou I tēnei rā, ki o koutou maunga teitei, me o awa, me o moana e rere ana, tēnā koutou. He karakia tīmata. Ka tauha whakatau te rangi me te whenua. Ka tauha whakatau te mātuku mai raratonga. Ko ia I rukuhia, he manawa pauroto. Ko ia I rukuhia, he manawa pauwaho. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Over to you, Murray.
Kia ora, Reginald. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar exploring sponge cities and what they mean for Aotearoa New Zealand. I'd first like to acknowledge our fantastic partners at WSP, whose support and expertise helps us develop reports on a range of issues related to sustainable urban environments, of which last week's report on sponge cities is the latest. A very warm welcome also to our Helen Clark Foundation members. Our foundation is an evidence-based, independent and non-partisan think tank, and we couldn't do what we do without your support. If you're not a member of the foundation and you enjoy this webinar, please do consider supporting our work by becoming a member at Helen Clark, that's all one word, .foundation, or by signing up to our free newsletters. And I think you can see a link in the chat section to do just that. Before we begin today's webinar, I'll just quickly note that our foundation has webinars coming up on a few topics, one on key global trends and their implications for New Zealand with special guest David Skilling, another on New Zealand's trade policy with Vangelis Vitalis, and another on long COVID. So please keep an eye out in your inboxes for those, and if you're not on our lists, please do sign up. For those of you who haven't joined many of our webinars before, it's worth noting that this is not a normal Zoom call. You are not on camera and you can't unmute, so there's no risk anyone can see or hear you eating your lunch. That said, we would love for you to participate in the webinar, and the best way for you to do that is to submit questions as they occur to you during the session by typing them into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote for questions that others have submitted by clicking on the thumbs up button, and more votes means a question is more likely to be asked. You'll also see there is a separate chat function. We put links into that section during the webinar, but please put your questions into the Q&A area. So today's webinar will explore sponge cities and how New Zealand's urban areas can survive and thrive in the face of increasingly intense rainfall. We chose this topic earlier in the year because we'd seen the damage that the Auckland anniversary floods and Cyclone Gabrielle caused in Auckland and around the North Island. And we thought there'd be broad interest in how New Zealand could become more resilient. It's been really exciting to see just how much interest there is in this topic. Because for all that a sponge city approach feels relevant and necessary in 2023, it's only going to become more necessary in the years ahead as a warming climate delivers more and more intense rainfall in our urban areas. So hopefully discussions like these can generate long-term planning and decision-making that makes urban areas in New Zealand better able to survive and thrive in the years ahead. So the webinar will begin with Carly Mercier, our Foundation's Deputy Director and WSP Fellow, giving us a 15-minute summary of her report before we move into a panel discussion with Carly and our two WSP experts, Regional Prophet and Liam Foster, addressing a range of questions around sponge cities. And then at the 40-minute mark, we'll switch to a Q&A session. And at that point, I'll put the questions you've entered into the Q&A section to today's panel. So that's it for housekeeping. I'll now ask Carly and the other members of our panel, Reginald and Liam, to introduce themselves. Then Carly will give us a quick summary of her excellent report. So Carly, over to you to start with the introductions.
Helps to unmute yourself. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko au, ko ka pokatau mahaka te maunga, ko Owhi o te awa, no Ōtepoti aho, ko te whanganui a tārata kāinga, ko Carly Mercier toko ingoa, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Very excited to be here today to talk to you about sponge cities, which I think offer a really exciting set of solutions to help us weather the storms that are on the way. So thanks for having us. Reginald, I'll pass over to you to introduce yourself.
Kia ora no tātou, he uri au o Poraurangi, e noho ana au ki te tai rāwhiti, ko Original Prophet, I hope. My iwi is Ngāti Porou, and I'm based here in Gisborne in the Tai Rāwhiti. My role at WSP leads the execution of WSP's Rautaki Māori strategy. I have extensive resource and environmental planning experience, both in the public and private sectors here in Aotearoa New Zealand. Also undertake the role of Independent Hearing Commissioner. And I'm also the chair of Te Kōkiringa Taumata, the New Zealand Planning Institute. Kia ora.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko ingarangi te whakaparanga mai, engari ko Derbyshire te whenua tupu, ko Otatahi ohi noho ana, hei kaiara taki hangarau wai OEWSP, ko Liam Foster toku ingoa. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, Liam Foster from our WSP Christchurch office. I'm a technical principal in water. My predominant expertise is around urban drainage, urban flood risk management, and supporting our communities to navigate the challenges of climate adaptation.
Great, I'm just going to start the slideshow. So why I wanted to look at this topic when we were thinking about a new topic back in January, February, we were thinking that flooding is our most common natural hazard in New Zealand. Our country has a substantial flood event on average once every 8 months, so it's a significant issue. And then of course, earlier this year, floods were in our public consciousness in a really major way after the terrible events and tragic loss of life as well in January and February as part of the Auckland anniversary floods, and then followed hot on the heels with Cyclone Gabrielle. So I went into this topic really excited to see whether sponge cities could offer us practical and effective solutions to make our cities and towns more resilient to these floods. And I guess we're all sort of used to hearing the doom and gloom about climate change, and I was really keen to investigate sponge cities because I think it can provide a vision of something positive and achievable that we can actually do to make ourselves more resilient, and also not just make cities more resilient, but also make them nicer places to live as well. So yeah, let's just start the slideshow. Yeah, so I won't spend a huge amount of time on this because I think a lot of people probably already know the basics of climate change and why we need a new approach. But in a nutshell, more intense rainfall's on the way. So at the moment, so over time with climate change, we're going to get some cities being drier overall in terms of annual average rainfall and some being wetter in terms of annual average rainfall. But all cities or all towns are likely to experience more spiky or more intense rainfall events. So, we're already seeing this happening, and we already know that climate change, that these events or more spiky rainfall events can be attributed to climate change with a high degree of probability, according to the International Panel on Climate Change. So it's already happening, and it's going to get worse, and we need to be preparing our cities to be able to handle these more spiky weather events without causing a loss of life and without having that major damage to houses and businesses and humans' livelihoods that we saw earlier on this year. We already have 1 in 7, something like that, New Zealanders living in flood-prone areas, which is absolutely huge. So that the issue is already urgent. We already need to be acting pretty quickly. Combined with that issue, we've got aging pipes and infrastructure. So we all will have heard about this in the news, but we're massively underinvesting in our grey infrastructure. And by grey infrastructure, I mean stuff made of concrete mostly, like pipes and drains. And we're only investing about a quarter of what we need to be investing each year just to keep it up to standard, let alone prepare for the future. So we're not ready in that sense at all for what's coming. We also have the fact that cities are becoming less green and we're losing trees. So the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment did some great research on this earlier on this year, a report called Are We Building Harder, Hotter Cities? The answer being yes, we are. We're losing a lot of green space in our cities over time. And one of the places we're losing the most green space is actually in private residences, which really surprised me. There's also a trend to build bigger houses on smaller patches of land. And then there's also a trend to be less keen, I guess, to have a vegetable garden, and for people then to be covering over what used to be gardens with driveways and other hard impermeable surfaces, or even building in their backyards, building new housing in their backyards. And we're also losing trees at a great rate because of our regulatory environment. They've been cut down at a huge rate. And if you're interested to see how your city is fared in this space, you could look at the Global Forest Watch website. They've got it's a really good tool that you can look to see how fast your city is losing trees. Maybe quite sobering. A further compounding issue is that cities are going to have to be able to house more people. So in the next 25 years, we'll need to be able to house about 1 million more people in our cities, mostly in our bigger cities. And we have to be able to do that in a way that's going to not make our cities less absorbent by covering over our green spaces. And then finally, we're not properly tracking risk at the moment. So we don't have, some cities are tracking risk well, some are not. We don't have sort of consistency. We don't have a national database that prioritizes cities according to their risk of flooding, which I think is a weakness. There is some work going on with MB and NIWA to rectify that, but that's a few years off. But that will be great when we're able to actually say, well, actually, this city is more at risk than this city and needs urgent prioritization of funding. We can't quite do that at the moment. So what are sponge cities? They're very cool is the first thing. So they work with water rather than against it. So they're less about trying to get rid of water. So at the moment we sort of funnel all our water off in pipes and drains as far to get it away from us as fast as possible. But sponge cities are more about making space for water, valuing it, trying to purify it and recycle it where possible as well. So it's good for droughts, not just for floods, for avoiding them, I should say. The techniques for sponge cities are not new, though the scale of it is, so the size of it. It's a citywide catchment level approach. Here in New Zealand, we often use a development approach known as water sensitive urban design, which is basically a sponge cities approach at a much smaller scale. So sponge cities is about putting that water sensitive urban design sort of process on steroids, making it consistent across all cities and towns, rather than just using it in some places some of the time. Sponge cities, I think, when I was researching it, it felt very right that it sits alongside Mātauranga Māori, which for those not New Zealand means traditional knowledge and wisdom. And this sort of sees humans as just one part of the environment. So the environment is something to work on behalf of rather than something to be controlled or dominated. And another key component of sponge cities is that we have to make space for water, so move people out of the way. We have to acknowledge, I guess, that towns are going to be more watery and make sure that we're not building on those places that are particularly vulnerable to flooding or will be in the future. And finally, we've defined sponge cities as sitting within a nature-based approach. Nature-based solutions is an international term, which is becoming more and more accepted here. And it's basically about trying to be holistic and trying to attack a whole lot of different problems at the same time. So rather than just focusing on stormwater management, we're focusing on improving biodiversity and making cities nicer places to live as well. So I thought it would be good to share a couple of case studies. So the idea originated, well, I guess the terminology, but maybe not the idea, originated in China. And China has 30 large-scale pilot projects covering cities across the country. And so they have a lot of good case studies that you can look at to see how the sponge cities model is working. So these are some pictures of Haiku City in Hainan Island. And Hainan Island was picked as one of the Chinese sponge cities' leading demonstration sites because it was flooding frequently, it was very polluted, there was a lot of habitat loss. So the city's a bit bigger than Auckland. Excuse me. What they did was they integrated areas that were at risk of flooding with wetlands, ponds, rice paddies, parks, and coastal habitats, and sort of formed a holistic sponge city system across the whole city, which would retain, clean, and recycle water. They moved buildings from floodplains and they replaced concrete flood walls with embankments made from earth and vegetation. And alongside the river there, you can see in that picture, they planted terraced wetlands, and the plants that they use are ones that can help to recycle the water so that when it reaches the river, it's been purified. And then they also work to make spaces beautiful and good for both humans and biodiversity. And so you can see there some raised pathways through the mangroves alongside the river. The next example I chose was Singapore. Singapore, the reason I chose it is it's got an average monthly rainfall of nearly twice that of Auckland because it has monsoons. So they had major flood events there in 2010, 2011. And since then, they've been building their city to be more and more resilient using green and blue infrastructure. So they've invigorated the wetlands, they've daylighted river channels. So rivers that had been concreted over and put through pipes have been resurfaced and naturalized back to the way they were before. And in some cases, they've also been deepened and widened. They've planted native trees alongside rivers to absorb and filter stormwater runoff. And they've also added rooftop gardens and lots more green and blue spaces overall. And the result is that the flood-prone areas have reduced from something like 3,200 hectares in the city to just 30 hectares today, so only 1% of what the flood areas were before. Does it still flood there? Yeah, it does. They have flash floods because they have monsoons, but what they find now is that those floods go down really quickly within an hour, and they're not flooding houses in the same way as they were before. So it's a big success. Do we have sponge cities in New Zealand? No, not yet, but we have sponge neighbourhoods, and we have a lot of really good work at a smaller scale level, but what we want to see is that being made bigger and across whole cities, across whole catchments. So one great example of stream daylighting in New Zealand is Dudley Creek. We can see a picture there. So after the big earthquakes in Christchurch, floods became more common because the land and river patterns had changed. So Dudley Creek was a remediation project which has been able to bring flooding levels back to how it was before the earthquake. So they widened the waterway, did lots of planting alongside, and created a really nice place for locals to visit at the same time. And we've got quite a few examples of nice work on creeks around New Zealand as well. You can have a look in the report for some more ideas. And then another great example of a sponge approach in New Zealand is the Green Slade Reserve in Auckland on North Coast. So the Aotearoa stream was daylighted, and then they transformed the reserve into a stormwater detention park. So at the back of that flooded picture is the park, and it was a playing field was sort of lowered by 1 metre, and then they underlaid it with lots of quick draining fill. And during the Auckland floods this year, it dealt with 12 million litres of water during a 15-hour period. So that photo at the front there is how it looked by midday the next day. So it actually drained quickly. So that kept all that water going into the neighbourhood houses. So and prevented a lot of houses from being flooded. So in terms of the cost of sponge cities, if we think about how much floods are costing in New Zealand at the moment, around about 160 million, they were costing around about 160 million a year just in direct costs in terms of insurance payouts. This has been going up year on year for quite a few years now. If you look at just the Auckland anniversary floods, the cost there is expected to be around 4 billion. So we're talking quite big numbers in terms of, the impacts of floods in New Zealand. And of course, the cost is not about money alone. It's about, money is just an easy marker for the damage, for that wider loss that happens. So loss of life, loss of livelihoods, impact on food security, and all the emotional impacts that floods cause as well, that can go on and on for years in terms of stress, anxiety, uncertainty, that kind of thing. And then also loss of significant cultural places such as burial sites and traditional food collection sources. We know that in New Zealand, 80% of marae are on flood-prone land. So there are lots of negative potential impacts from floods. So the key point here is that investing to avoid those losses is far, far cheaper than not doing so and then having to clean up afterwards. So I think that killer point at the top there, the Global Commission on Adaptation found returns on investment for, if we invest in adaptation early, we can get a sort of as much as a 10-to-1 return on investment compared with not investing at all and having to clean up afterwards. Then there's really good evidence that sponge cities approaches give better value for money than more conventional stormwater approaches. A figure there of 50% more economical, 28% more effective. Wuhan, another example from China, which we know for other COVID-related reasons, but in this case, it's a positive news story. So they transformed themselves to a sponge city and saved $600 million US, which is more than $1 billion New Zealand, compared with the cost of equivalent grey infrastructure. So lots of good reasons to do it from a cost benefit as well. I wanted to just skip quickly through our key recommendations in the report. There are a lot of recommendations in there. So there's a lot of really quite specific ones that might be useful for councils and for the central government. But the main ones are really that, I guess first to say that we have a very complex regulatory space for stormwater management. So there are lots of different acts and bills and government policy documents to get your head around, and there's a lot of change in the space at the moment as well. We've got the Resource Management Act being renewed or turned into a number of different acts, and that process is partway through. And then there's the affordable water reforms, which were called the Three Waters reforms previously, and that's also still ongoing. So there's a lot of flux in this space. Even since this report was published, there's been a couple of new bills passed. So first point is that it's very complicated, but I think, you know, we've made a lot of progress over the last few years in New Zealand in terms of recognising that adaptation is really, really important. There's money also from central government going towards that process. But what's less good, I think, is that we don't yet have a clear vision in terms of the importance of taking nature-based approaches. I think that's just sort of starting to enter the lexicon. So our first national adaptation plan does mention nature-based solutions, but there's more work to do to sort of embed that, I think. There's no clear vision from central legislation about the need for water-sensitive urban design. So there's no national requirement that we do water-sensitive urban design and developments, which I think is a failing. There is a move to require regional councils to do spatial planning and to incorporate plans for reducing flood risk, especially under climate change. And that's new under the Spatial Planning Act, which actually passed last week. So that is a great thing. But I think the big failing is that we don't have currently a national direction or vision about the fact that we need to turn our cities into sponge cities. So that's what this report recommends. So our recommendations at the big picture about trying to bring sponge cities thinking, I guess, into the national, the regional, and the local level, that we need to do it really quickly, that we need to do it strategically, and that we need to just be really clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve. Also, I think it's important that we have high aspirations. So the Row Order Indigenous Worldview Framework was developed as part of the work to create our country's first national adaptation plan. And under that framework, the idea is that rather than assessing outcomes against minimum requirements, they're assessed against a measure of natural abundance. Row Order means natural abundance. So you're looking for not just stormwater management, but you're looking for much more holistic, big picture successes where, you know, a vibrant environment, an abundant environment, a healthy environment. So we also made recommendations on sponge cities at the city and catchment level, at the neighbourhood level, and then also at the private residence level. So I'll just bump through really quickly a couple of those. There are many more. These are the big picture ones. So at the city and catchment level, we're recommending that councils plan for and provide public green spaces as they do infrastructure. Under the Local Government Act, councils are obviously required to provide for infrastructure, but they're not required to provide a certain amount of public green space. They can take contributions from developers for grey infrastructure, unlimited, at an unlimited amount, whatever they need to pay for it. But they're more restricted in terms of what they can take from developers in terms of providing alternative green spaces. So about sort of evening that up so that green and blue spaces are seen as infrastructure just in the same way that grey infrastructure, such as pipes and drains, are seen. I think that's really important. And then requiring councils to plan for nature-based sponge city solutions as well as part of their new spatial plans that they'll be doing under the new legislation which was passed last week. So that's at the city level, and then at the neighbourhood and development level we had loads and loads of recommendations, but this is about what we can do on suburban and urban roads and on existing and new housing developments. So we had recommendations about retrofitting roads and town squares and other public spaces to include things like tree pits and more rain gardens and grassy swales down the side of streets or down the middle of streets, for example. Recommendations about making new residential developments more spongy using water sensitive urban design. One of the things we found in the research is that when you do a new development, often what's happening is all the topsoil is being removed, the ground's being compacted, the houses are being built, and then the topsoil has been added back on, and often that topsoil is too thin to really actually plant trees or big shrubs. So one of the recommendations is about minimising soil disturbance in new developments, clustering houses, things like that, to leave more green spaces available. And also about, there's a recommendation about raising the national minimum standard for new developments in terms of how much of the development area must be left unsealed, because at the moment that's a bit inconsistent. And a lot of houses are built with not much green space around them, and then often that's paved over after the consenting process anyway. So about making those regulations a bit better. And then at the local level, see Murray's there, he's probably worried that I'm going over time, are you, Murray? At the local level, this is the last slide. It's about things like redirecting spouts, downpipes into gardens, installing rain tanks, unblocking flow paths, things like that, and replacing lawns with trees. Sorry, second last slide. The final slide is just about some of those things we need to do to support our implementation of our of sponge cities, which is things like working with tangata whenua. One of the key findings was that using incremental approaches as part of a long-term vision is really, really important and useful. So even if councils or houses, if you're only able to do a tiny little thing, that's still well worth doing. It'll have still a big impact in the amount of flooding that you can prevent. So well worth doing. And yes, it looks like I need to finish my presentation because in my enthusiasm, I've gone over time. Sorry about that, Murray.
Not at all. Thank you, Carly, for a very quick summary of a very comprehensive report. And obviously, if you'd like to see that report, you can view it on our foundation website. I see my panelists have joined. And just a reminder to webinar viewers today, if you've got a question for the panel, please enter it in the Q&A area or vote on others' questions there, and I'll put these to our panelists shortly. But now we'll move into the panel session, and the first question today will go to Reginald, but Carly and Liam, please feel free to jump in at the end. So Reginald, what does an Aotearoa specific model of sponge cities look like, and how could this be different from other countries?
Yeah, kia ora. So sponge cities, as shown, has been applied internationally and at a small scale here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But we need to take a holistic view to adapt this to an Aotearoa New Zealand frame. It will be different as it needs to reflect our reality, our environment, our geology, our land uses, our towns and cities, and our knowledge base here. In saying this, sponge cities approach has got strong similarities to a kaupapa Māori Aotearoa frame. It's a shift away from managing and working on the environment to working with the environment, recognising its form and function, recognising the flow of water, its needs, its energy, and its mauri. Life energy is a simple translation. Recognising that climatic change, whilst also that we live within our environment, not over the top of the environment. So there's a lot of similarities there from that from that perspective. So I believe we need to bring together the best of all we have. We need to recognise and value the knowledge within Mātauranga Māori in a way that integrates alongside the knowledge within engineering and science that ultimately respects our environment. And that's the shifting here in regards to this, respecting our environment, its power, its strengths, its needs. That translates into how together we define and implement that Aotearoa New Zealand approach. So yeah, there will be differences in regards to how we need to adapt it and apply it here in Aotearoa New Zealand.
Thanks, Reginald. Next question I'll direct to Liam in the first instance. Liam, what are we already doing well in New Zealand? Are there good examples of sponge city approaches here in New Zealand we can build on?
Yeah, absolutely, Murray. I mean, starting from a practitioner perspective, we've got a whole series of guidance and exemplary applications that are already in place and date back for a number of years, not least of all to 20 years ago this year that the publication of the Christchurch City Council's Waterways, Wetlands and Drainage Guide was made available. And that really revolutionised the way the thinking had been across Aotearoa at that time, and at a very similar time that Sponge City was really kicking off into China, and encouraging people to work with the natural features and processes within the landscape. That management of the waterways and wetlands, including that restoration potential and the need to protect it, and that we integrate it with other values. So they talk about six values there: ecology, landscape, recreation, heritage, drainage, and culture. And that forms the foundation of that multidisciplinary sustainable approach. So that's a really good sort of applications of guidance, and that's certainly been built on over the years since. Since then, we've, I suppose, developed some good case study examples. So the picture behind me is the Aotearoa Avon River Precinct, other projects within Christchurch around the land drainage recovery programme, for example, and the delivery of the stormwater services around the southwest area growth area, which was pretty much grew up overnight after the earthquakes of 2010 and 11. And that delivered a network of green infrastructure across those major city catchments, including the recently opened Te Kura wetland, which is a fabulous place for people to go and see native planting and bird species start to come back into our city. In other parts, water sensitive urban design features are being applied more regularly across councils, across developments, and particularly in those easier parts, i.e. the new developments, the new greenfield land that's being changed into urban land use. But there are some really good retrofit examples, and Carly mentioned a couple of them in terms of Te Ara Arafata and the Green State Reserve, Te Aonanga, Oakley Creek up in Auckland, running through Mount Roskill. But fundamentally, as Carly states, we're doing this in a really piecemeal nature, and some really, really great one-off applications. But our appeal really here is to concentrate our efforts to create a holistic catchment or urban area approach to sponge cities, and we have to connect them across the communities and urban areas for it to really land the anticipated resilience, well-being, and unlock the ecosystem benefits that our natural environment can help provide us with and help us survive an uncertain climate change. It's not a luxury, right, or a nice-to-have item anymore, and we have to do it consistently, and we have to on new greenfield sites. But we really, really need to accelerate how we renew our cities to support that the four aspects of community well-being to deliver those more resilient outcomes.
Yeah, and just further to that, Murray, I think we're making some positive steps in regards to our legislation and policy directives that are being applied. We've got obviously Te Mana o Te Wai under or through the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. There's some positives movement being put forward through Te Hauora o Te Taiao in the Natural Built Environments Bill, and that integrated approach that Carly touched on in terms of the Spatial Planning Bill. So it'll be great to be able to see those come through with, but I totally support what Liam is saying here. We need to have that combined, coordinated, integrated approach, real clear intent and purpose around what we're trying to achieve in this space.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Reginald. For this next question, we'll start with Carly. What are the big challenges or barriers to implementing sponge city approaches in New Zealand?
Well, I feel like perhaps one of the bigger ones is probably a lack of a sense of urgency and a lack of prioritization and risk assessment. So I feel like as I mentioned earlier, we're not we're not really assessing which places are most at risk. We're sort of responding after an emergency and cleaning up the mess, and then quickly trying to sort out the problems that we've now discovered there. So I think having a real strategic plan around understanding which places in New Zealand are most at risk, and having a plan in place to address those places that are most at risk first, and having central funding to do that is really important. We're doing some of that, but I don't think we're doing it properly and consistently. And also addressing the fact that we're losing green space at such a rate, I think is a really important thing that we need to do, and we had quite a few recommendations in the report to turn that around. But yeah, I think those are two of the two key things that we probably need to be getting stuck into. What about you guys? Yeah,
I think certainly retrofitting our urban areas is a really big challenge, and not to be sniffed at. And certainly kind of if we're looking to enhance those green open spaces in these areas, it tends to immediately fall foul of each development's limitations of direct economic costs, as opposed to the opportunity cost benefits that can be accrued. And so certainly we recommend within our work that we should be looking to enable us to look at the whole of life costing, including the things that are regularly called intangible benefits. So it's not just a fiscal decision. Our pace of urban renewal is slow, and probably would be about on average 1% of a city per year might get renewed. So it's going to take a long time. So you need to set that vision. It may, of course, have been accelerated in more recent times by the catastrophic events of recent disasters and the recent policy settings around urban intensification. So there's an opportunity there for us to really land significant change when we're renewing our urban areas. And then the challenge of actual delivery really ranges from the traditional gambit of there's a shortage of technical expertise. There's always issues around aligning budgets and programs across multiple stakeholders. And actually we need that timely, open and honest interagency collaboration, with a large focus really on who looks after it for the long run, to make sure that the facilities are performing as we expect them to do over the long time. And of course, who pays?
Well, speaking of who pays, Carly, we'll put this question to you again first. What is the cost-benefit calculation of sponge cities, and how do we afford this?
Yeah, so I had a slide on that earlier, but I think the main thing is really that the cost of not doing it is far greater than the cost of doing it. So that stat there about it can be as much as 10 to 1 in terms of you might end up paying 10 times more if you don't invest early in an adaptation. So if we look at China and what they spent, they've spent around, they invested initially 20 billion for the first 3 years. They invested $20 billion over 16 pilot cities. So we're talking about billions of dollars here, but if you compare that to what we are already spending on grey infrastructure, that sort of puts that into perspective. I guess we're expecting to spend around $30 to $50 billion, I think it is, over the next 15 years to renew our wastewater networks, our 3 waters network, including wastewater, stormwater and drinking water. So we're talking quite big sums, but we can spread it over a number of years, and we can also spread it out between different parties as well. It doesn't all have to be funded sort of centrally or regionally. So for example, private residence owners can implement sponge cities approaches, and business owners can. Some of the research I saw was that using industrial area to insert green infrastructure there can have a huge impact on flood risk. So Ministry of Education could be making schools more absorbent. There's lots of ways to, I guess, spread the costs around, and we can spread it over time as well. But the main thing is that we need to be quite strategic about that and working out what we need to do urgently and getting stuck into that as soon as possible, because not doing it will cost a lot more.
Excellent. Thanks, Carly. Our last question before we move into the audience questions, and we'll start with you, Liam. And if I could ask you to keep your question brief, because we're slightly behind time. What can people do at home to make their property spongier and to reduce flood risks?
Yeah, Kia ora, thank you. I mean, the key really is to look to how you can mimic those natural systems of allowing rainwater to be absorbed and filtered across your property or site, rather than quickly getting rid of it and into the storm drains. Yeah, absolutely. There's always a question around the effectiveness of these measures. Depends wholly on your location, your geology, the characteristics of your property. So you probably need to take a little bit of advice or just be sensible about it all. But certainly some of those individual steps could be capturing it and using it where it lands, rainwater tanks, rain gardens, green roofs, slowing the flow off your property. So rather than paving your driveway, having permeable surfaces, choosing native plants that are more water tolerant and drought tolerant, if you depending on what part of the country you're going to be living in, really comes down to reducing those impervious surfaces on your property and making putting the trees back and the vegetation back, and you can make your property a bit more resilient. So work out where your overland flow paths are through your property, and look to consider how you can keep that away from your property so that you're not necessarily the ones that are suffering from flooding events in the future.
Great. Great, thank you, Liam. Okay, we'll now move to audience questions. And the most popular question we've had today, it seems like we are just focused on applying Sponge City's concepts on urban areas and not on rural areas. But during Cyclone Gabrielle, most of the areas affected by the cyclone were in rural areas. Can we use this concept in rural areas for stormwater management? Carly, I know you thought about this a little bit in the production of the report, so perhaps we start with you, and then Liam or Reginald, please jump in.
Yeah, so it is an urban approach. So it's about building on the fact that our urban areas have become so impermeable and covered with concrete and so on, and about working to remedy that. So it's not directly applicable in that way to rural areas because they're often quite spongy already. But there are a lot of crossover. There is a lot of crossover in terms of things like keeping rivers clear and making space for water and ensuring, working with the natural contours of the land and so on. So there are crossover things, but in general, the approach is designed for urban areas. But I'm sure Liam and Reginald can probably give some insights as to the kind of things that would be more useful in a rural area.
Kia ora, I'll jump in first ahead of Liam, who rounded out very well for us. But living in the Tairāwhiti and living through Cyclone Gabrielle, yes, definitely there was strong impact up the East Coast and obviously in the Hawke's Bay, Napier area, and including Wairoa in our rural areas. And that's why I think the applicability here in the is in regards to how we apply our Te Ao Māori frame within this, because a lot of those frames are actually consistent both in the urban and the rural. They're working with and with our environment, respecting its needs, its synergies, as I said earlier, applies both in a rural and an urban area. We need to be looking at the place that we fit within and alongside, rather than dominating and working on our environment. And that calls into play our knowledge around our geology here in the Tairāwhiti and in other areas, but also our land use practices that are currently in play. And obviously in the Tairāwhiti, there's a strong focus on land use practices in our rural areas. So fundamentally, the principles within it are transferable. The application within the Sponge Cities is focused on cities in regards to what we can do in those urban areas. But I think the importance here around applying an Aotearoa New Zealand frame transcends that. And I think that gives us consistency in our approach as well.
Second, all of that, effectively the concept's the same. Keep people and property out of the way of where the water wants to go, and you won't go far wrong. And allow the nature, let nature to have that space to soak it up a bit better. That's what it is, whether you apply it to a city or to a rural area.
Thanks, Liam. Next question from Annika Min. How can Sponge Cities be integrated with multi-hazard risk reduction approaches, for example, wildfire, drought, earthquake risk, and themselves be more resilient to the climate extremes at the dry end of the spectrum? Who would like to take that? Multi-hazard risk reduction approaches.
Okay, I'll go first. Annika, great question. Again, very much the same things here. So By providing nature the space there and the appropriate planting of the natural species in there, you can do a lot in terms of controlling your wildfire risk. You can do a lot in terms of your drought tolerance. You can do a lot in terms of urban heat island impacting around the temperature of the urban areas. So you can do a lot on those type of fronts of reducing the tolerance or the risk to our people and property. In terms of earthquake and other seismic activities, again, if we're being a bit less, if we're out of the areas that are, shall we say, usually wet, we have less chances of that causing issues around liquefaction on damaging our properties as well. That's off the top of my head. I could probably think about some more. Reg?
Oh, look, I totally agree with the question. A really, really good question. And I suppose drawing on a little bit of personal experience, I've just returned from an international trip to Spain and Dubai, going through the middle of heat waves in both locations, walking around those cities, those towns where there's a lot of impervious surfaces, the heat that is the latent heat that is retained within those concrete stone infrastructure, whether it's roads or buildings, definitely has a you can feel it late into the evening, and so this approach is about how we can actually change that, not putting that grey infrastructure in surrounding us all, and how do we connect with that I suppose softer, more softer environment that we can have within our cities. So great question. I think the opportunity is here, the management of water, both in the wet and during the dry parts of our seasons.
And just very quickly to summarize on that, the sponge, there was a lot of great research that I found on things like urban heat islands and how having more trees in cities can reduce temperatures in cities by up to 4 degrees. So that heating stuff is really, really important. We may think it's not an issue right now, but it may become more and more an issue as time goes by, and having green spaces and trees is really important for that. And yeah, as Reginald mentioned, sponge cities really helps a lot with not just stormwater management, but drought management as well.
Thanks all. Next question from Beth McGregor. How do we manage pollutants and debris that can more easily enter our water systems with daylighted river channels? Reginald, should we start with you for this one?
Okay, first up, one, I think we all have to take some personal responsibility in terms of the way we treat our environment, the way in which we throw rubbish around, add pollutants into it. There's technology available, obviously, which I think Liam will be best to answer that. But I think it's that personal responsibility, and how do we actually get that through in regards to and I don't want to say rules, coming from a planning background, because it's not something that there should be rules for in terms of that personal responsibility, but in way in which we can capture some of those pollutants, how we can stop it from progressing into our waterways, using that technology, which I think, there's quite a lot of good application already in Aotearoa New Zealand, but it's about making sure we've got a comprehensive frame for that.
So effectively, careful thought and consideration can help to mitigate a lot of this potential. Education and awareness is another part of it all, and stop using so much single plastic is another part. So again, there are means and mechanisms to overcome it all, but I think you'll find that most people, and there's some good examples from South Korea and the Chongyang River, Chongqing, I can't pronounce it, apologies, but effectively where they opened up some green infrastructure into the middle of the city, people flock to the area, not least of all for the things that Callie mentioned, and that's around the urban cooling factor, as well as the being close to green and blue areas to enjoy and spend some time in.
Great, thank you, Reginald. Thank you, Liam. Next question is a detailed one from Stu Ferrand, and Carly, I'll probably ask you to address this in the first instance. So Carly made the clear linkage between the concepts of sponge cities and water sensitive design, which Aotearoa has really struggled to successfully implement at scale. How do we all ensure that decision makers and practitioners understand the difference between solutions that provide resilience to flooding versus those that are beneficial for frequent rainfall, which impacts on ecosystem health and all the values our environment supports? So Carly, you in the first instance.
Yes, I'll just quickly skim the rest of that because I was talking about rain gardens. Okay. And talking about how some green infrastructure can be easily overwhelmed and saturated in floods. And one thing I'd say about that is that it's never going to be a silver bullet. So we're not going to be able to completely stop floods by using sponge cities. I think one of the key things to note is that we are going to be getting waterier and we are going to be having more water. And so the key thing is to make space for that water and to ensure that rivers have space to rise, and that when they rise, they've got trees and plants to absorb a lot of that extra water, and they're designed in such a way that it doesn't flow into people's houses, and that, you know, public spaces can be designed to flood rather than houses. But and the main thing is then to not be building in places which are likely to flood in some of those bigger events. So it does mean spreading yourself out, making more space for water overall, which can be quite difficult in cities that are quite built up already. So thinking about that. Water sensitive design is, yeah, as you've mentioned there, Stu, is used in some places and not in others. And one of our recommendations was that it should be used in all developments. There's a clear cost benefit for it overall. It's cheaper and it provides other benefits as well. So we'd like to see that being used across the board. I hope that answers your question. It's a complicated question and I'm not sure that I have covered everything, but perhaps Liam and Reginald can help me.
Carly, well, I think Stu, you're completely right. We've got a basket or a kete of measures that we can apply across the city, and depending on the situation you're trying to do. But fundamentally, we need to get to the situation where we're taking better care of our water courses, not least of all because Te Manawatū requires us to under new legislation, but actually just because it's good for us and our future humanity. So sponge cities, water sensitive urban design will certainly help us to scrub up our water before it hits our receiving environments for the smaller events, and then the larger events. It's just about making sure that people, property, and things of critical infrastructure are just not in the way.
Great, thanks, Liam. Our next question is from John Milne. Would these sponge cities be paired with other upstream flood prevention measures? Is sponge watersheds the goal? So Liam, we've talked about this a little bit, but if I could ask you to start off reflecting on that question, please.
Yeah, again, a great point, John. It all comes down to context, where you are in your catchment. You could have upstream or downstream protection from a nature-based solutions perspective, particularly as a lot of our cities are coastal, and we've got a challenge around sea level rise. Sponge cities will not save us from sea level rises of over 2 meters, right? Nothing will. But sponge cities will certainly make the transition to 2 meters a little less painful for us and our future sanity. Upstream flood management, be that nature-based or detention basins, will also help us to inhabit a space that potentially would have been where water once roamed the land.
Great, thanks, Liam. Next question from Lynn Na. What is being done to ensure no more development happens on floodplains or low-lying areas that are likely to be flooded, for example, close to rivers? Liam, why don't we start with you again for that one?
Fundamentally not enough. But equally, we've got a housing crisis. Most of our cities have been developed in the locations they are for various reasons, usually around access to water and access to coastal ports. So we do live in a very vulnerable land to flooding. What our report and research shows here effectively is that whilst we can continue to live in these areas, we probably need to think about going up and not out, so not taking up more of the floodplain. concentrating our residences or our businesses into smaller areas and enabling that space for that water to do its natural thing.
Yeah, and just further to that, Murray, I know that the Ministry for the Environment and a number of different other government agencies are looking at this at the moment in regards to provisions that can be put in place to prevent that. But yes, there's a lot of pressure being applied in terms of development for this housing supply needs. But it's about making sure that we've got good data in regards to it, and I think that we actually have got relatively pretty good data across Aotearoa New Zealand, and then making sure that we've got policy and framework in there that actually ensures that we don't develop in those areas. And again, as it has been said by both of the presenters, giving that space for the environment and water to go where it's going to go. So we need that policy direction. We need engineering solutions. We need to understand what's there. Yeah, so there's a bit of work to be done, but still progressing. We need to crack on with this urgently.
Great, thanks, Reginald. Thanks, Liam. Next question is from Claudia Hellberg. Do you see that there is a difference in definition of a sponge city versus a water-sensitive city? Which of the panelists would like to take that one?
I'm happy to do it. I see Liam's laughing, he might have something to add. I think a lot of it is just to do with definition. There's a lot of different techniques similar to water sensitive urban design, which are used in different countries, which have different names, which are all very similar to one another. And they all are, I guess, tactics or tools that you could use to create a sponge city. And sitting over that, I think, is the concept of nature-based solutions on one hand, and mātauranga Māori and other Indigenous-based knowledge solutions on the other hand. So it's kind of all part of a holistic whole. And I think sponge cities is basically water sensitive urban design on steroids, because it applies to the whole city or the whole catchment, with a few extra things thrown in because you're talking about bigger areas, so managing rivers rather than streams or whatever. So very similar. That would be my overall impression of it. Did you have something to add there, Liam, when you were laughing before?
Yeah, no, I was just urging you to answer it first. There really isn't, Claudia, in terms of the I suppose the aspirations around them all. Effectively, we're looking for water to be fundamental to how we design our urban spaces. That's effectively all, and both of them achieve it. There's one and the same to a certain extent, and sponge implies that you've got a sponge to enable that water to infiltrate into, whereas water sensitive can enable some other activities to take place.
Thanks, Liam. Let's do a very quick last question here for Emily Symes. How hard is it to apply green stormwater solutions to existing cities? I might leave the question there so we can have a quick answer and close on time. Liam, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah. So it's increasingly fraught, mainly for the reasons we talked about. So it comes down to people are used to living in areas where stormwater is not a problem because they have buried it into pipes. It only becomes a problem when that infrastructure is challenged by intensity or by poor maintenance or other things. So their normal day-to-day life is not impacted really by stormwater, and so therefore they won't necessarily see the value of us opening up these streams again. That being said, we've got bigger and bigger extreme events to cope with. That actually require us to have some ability for those exceedance flows to go somewhere and not through people's properties, and the other part is we're just throwing our pollution into the waterway without actually looking about what impact it's having on the wider ecosystem because it's so buried away. Rich?
Great. Rich.
No, I think you've answered it really well. Thanks, Liam.
I just wanted to add that for highly built up inner city areas, there can be all sorts of other challenges, like things like infrastructure, utility lines and so on under the pavements, which make it harder to plant trees there and things like that. But there are a lot of really practical solutions you can use, like green roofs on buildings, or finding small spaces to build tiny urban forests, or insert pocket parks and things like that. So there's a lot of things you can do at a very small scale that you can fit into small spaces. So I think every place should be able to do some sponge city solutions.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists this afternoon, and thank you to our audience for some very insightful questions. Before we close out, I'll hand over to Reginald for a closing karakia.
Kia ora. Tā kina te mauri kei ahau he mauri tu he mauri ora. Tā wharautia tihei mauri ora. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Well, thank you all again for joining today's webinar, and we hope to see you all again for the next one. No ora mai, mā te wā.